Hello and welcome to Tishman Auditorium at the New School. My name is Pippin Parker. I'm the director of the New School for Drama. And I'm pleased to welcome you here tonight for this pre-release screening of The Last Ride. Hank Williams is known today to be one of the most influential songwriters of the 20th century, not just in country music, but in all American music. Music greats such as Ray Charles, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and Bruce Springsteen, and many others have spoken about the significant impact Hank Williams had on their lives and their work. Bob Dylan said, "I started writing songs when I heard Hank Williams sing." The Rolling Stones have said Hank Williams influenced our music throughout our careers. Bruce Springsteen remembers sitting in my apartment and listening to Hank Williams over and over. And Ray Charles said, "Hank saved a lot of careers, including mine." Williams' songs have been covered by numerous artists, many of whom have had hits with them in pop, gospel, blues, and rock styles. And in 2010, Williams was posthumously awarded a special citation by the Pulitzer Prize Board for his craftsmanship as a songwriter who expressed universal feelings with poignant simplicity and played a pivotal role in transforming country music into a major musical and cultural force in American life. Referred to as music's original bad boy, Williams' too short life ended on his last ride to a gig in West Virginia. Inspired by those mysterious final days of Williams' life, The Last Ride is the story of his final road trip through the bleak Appalachian countryside of 1950s America. After the screening, we're going to gather here on stage for a discussion with the director of the film, Harry Thomason, one of the film's producers and creators of the soundtrack, Benji Gaither, daughter of Hank Williams, is a singer and songwriter in her own right, Jet Williams, and radio personality from WHPC 90.3's Michael Anthony. And we will, of course, be including your questions and comments at that time. We would particularly like to take this opportunity to thank Oxford American Magazine for their cooperation in promoting this event, and especially to thank the panelists for being here tonight and for working with New School to bring this event together. I thank you so much for being here, and for now, as they used to say, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Thank you. So let me start on that end and introduce our guests, Harry Thomason, who is the director of the movie, and let me just give you a little background on Harry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Harry's an award-winning director, producer of television series including Designing Women, miniseries such as The Blue and the Gray, and director of events including both presidential inaugurations of William Jefferson Clinton. Benji Gaither is a film producer, and what we should say, first of all, is wrote the soundtrack score of the movie.
Yeah.
And he's a producer on the film, son of gospel legends Bill and Gloria Gaither, and creator of the soundtrack, as I just mentioned, for the movie. Michael Anthony has been a radio personality. Michael, welcome. Radio personality on WPHC in New York City for more than 15 years. With his programs The Unforgettables and The Country Show, he has built a reputation as one of the most respected hosts in the music community. Throughout the years, more than 500 well-known figures in the world of pop, jazz, rock, R&B, and country have sat down with Mr. Anthony for in-depth biographical, maybe biological, that would be weird, biographical interviews. And last, it's our honor to introduce Jet Williams. Jet is Hank Williams' daughter, and a singer and songwriter in her own right. And she had contributed 4 songs on the film soundtrack. She's also the award-winning author of Ain't Nothing as Sweet as My Baby, the story of Hank Williams' lost daughter. Maybe we'll get into that in a little bit. So just to begin with, I wondered if we could take this little sort of slice of these few hours of Hank Williams' life and sort of fill in the portrait a little bit more, and maybe in particular in those years from sort of, in those years between 1948 and 52, he lived such a short life, and he was nationally famous for just a really small amount of time. So maybe if you could talk about who Hank Williams was in these few years before his death.
I would like to personally thank each and every one of y'all for coming out here to spend this, I guess y'all call it hot here in New York, afternoon to watch this movie. But as the daughter of Hank Williams, I want to personally thank you, each and every one, for coming out. And what you were saying about the man Hank Williams and the entertainer and the musician, between 1948 and the end of his career, I'd like to think that what he did was he actually threaded the eye of a needle in the fact to go from unknown to the stardom that he did. And the fact that he was hit the national scene with Move It On Over as one of his very first hit, to go in to make an appearance on the Grand Ole Opry in 1949, and to write all the songs he did, all the recordings he did, all the personal appearances, all the radio shows, and become the icon that he is, shows you the talent and the man and the legend that he is today.
Great. And what was do we have an idea of what celebrity was like for him in those days? I mean, you mentioned he had a tremendous touring schedule, et cetera. How famous was he? What were the crowds like? How well known was he in those last
He was
few
well
years?
known, but as in the movie, what you have to remember, he did some television shows, but who had a television back then? And other than you had a battery-operated radio, unless he came to your town, you actually didn't see him, and the MGM records actually didn't have his photo. And so, but he sold out the crowds, he packed the houses, he set the bar, he became the very first superstar. He was charting not only his own songs, but you take the Tony Bennett Cold Cold Heart, his songs were going over into the pop charts. The demands, I believe, on my dad at that time, especially in this back end of his life, were totally demanding in the fact that here you are just hitting home run after home run after home run, and everybody expects you to continue to just write those songs and make those #1 hits. You've got, in reality, all the women that were in your life, and also, too, you have a band and people that are depending on you for their livelihood, and the publishers and everybody, they were expecting those songs to go out. So I think he had a lot of, he was carrying a lot on his shoulders, but also too, he also set the standard that today's country music artists, they're standing on those shoulders.
And Harry, and the rest of you, I wonder if you could speculate or what your perspective is on what do we attribute his incredible legacy. And there are a lot of other artists. I mean, there are good artists who are his peers, and Roy Acuff and Jimmy Rogers, Bill Monroe. A lot of guys who were very famous, but have not had the same impact, it seems, on the successive generations of musicians, or either as personalities or as composers. What do you?
It was sort of interesting that there was an article in a magazine the other day about something was going on in Nashville, and there were big exhibits up, and these two record industry guys, were walking past one of the exhibits, and one of them was a well-known female country singer that's no longer with us, and they said, well, there's her exhibit, she's no longer with us. And then they walked by a Hank Williams exhibit, and the same guy, that's what he was commenting on and writing about. He said, and then we look at Hank Williams, and he's still with us. And it was hard to understand. And Michael can do a better job of answering this, I think, than any of us. But I think it has to do with Hank Williams' music strings were like tentacles, and they invaded all other kinds of music. And so all music genres owe something to Hank Williams.
I got an opinion about that. I think it comes down to songs. He was a great writer. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He was an artist. Especially, it comes down to he was a poet, and I'm a writer. I understood that. That's why I got attracted to the movie. We're still singing his songs today. With the artistry and of today, sometimes, artists, well, you need a pretty face, you need to go get the hottest producer, you need to go in the studio and do the drum machine, and then you need to have the coolest, and then they look at each other, oh, what about songs? Oh, let's write a song, okay. And, movies, same way. It comes down to a story, and it comes down to a song. And to me, that's why Hank Williams has lived. He's written some incredible songs that still, are being cut today. People recut them and recut them and recut them. He's one of those artists that stick to the wall. I think as an artist or a writer, that's what we all strive to do. I think your husband, Keith, coined the phrase, the hillbilly Shakespeare? He was the hillbilly Shakespeare. And not only that, he inspired Elvis. I think he inspired a lot of other artists. And that's what drew me to the picture. That's what drew me to the story. Was I'm just a big Hank Williams song guy.
Right. And Michael, I'm just wondering. Sorry to cut you off. Along with that, your perspective. Do we also have a sense of what his? Do we have a sense of what his creative process was like?
Well, Jet may even know more about as far as learning over the years of his creative, as far as the process of writing. Okay, I'm heard now. Okay. I was just going to mention. I think Benji was saying some interesting things. The interesting thing with Hank, he wasn't the first country star to cross over to the pop charts. For example, Eddie Arnold, who was quite popular before Hank, and at the same time, charted a string of crossover pop hits and had some appeal. But the thing with Hank Williams' music, and I know Jet and everybody feels the same way, he was really the first country star, I think, that people were covering. So I would say that, and this is going as far back, as the 40s and the early 50s, in his lifetime. And Tony Bennett, of course, doing Cold, Cold Heart is the greatest example of that, though others in the pop field at the time, Rosemary Clooney, Joe Stafford, and Joni James, Frankie Lane, all of these artists, while Hank was still here, were covering these songs. Now, these were mainstream pop singers. And that was the first time, I believe, that this was a country star was being covered by pop artists. And remember, this was just before rock and roll, so those are the artists that were hugely popular at the time. And that said a lot. And it also mentioned, even though as country as Hank was, and when you listen to his music, it sounds so country, hillbilly, of course, was the term at the time. But it was really amazing how the other artists of the other genres saw through that. And they wanted to grab a hold of that, and I think that says a lot of his songwriting and the appeal of it, and they were able to realize, no, this is just not country music, this is not hillbilly music, this is something above, this is American music. And of course, after that, all the rock and roll stars covering his songs, and I guess just about every genre, of music has taken a hold of his music, the jazz artists, and it's amazing who was actually recorded Hank Williams songs, even back in those earlier days, which I think is interesting.
And do we know who he claimed were influences on him? I think we have a sense from listening to the music and probably some of his biography. Do you know what he considered the influences on himself?
Well, I know Jimmy Rogers certainly had to be one of them. He was the father of country music. He laid the foundation, which I'm sure Hank built his sounds on. I know there was that gentleman, his last name was Payne, right? Rufus Payne, right? And that was somebody who's an unsung, he was not known, but only to your dad.
And also, too, his real hero was Roy Acuff. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they said that my dad came to Nashville sounding like Roy Acuff. And unlike today, they said, son, we've already got a Roy Acuff. You need to find your own style. And so then my dad started singing like Hank Williams. And but no, Roy Acuff was his hero.
But you can just look at it, and it's and Jed, I'm going to steal this story from you. Probably I've heard you talk, but because Jed told me, and then I had a chance to listen to both of them. I pulled them up. I grew up thinking that Bill Haley had the first rock and roll song, Rock Around the Clock. That was it. But if you go back 7 years, I believe, Jet, and you'll find Hank Williams did a song called Move It On Over, and it is exactly the same rhythm and everything as Rock Around the Clock. And so clearly he wrote the first rock and roll song.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah, but true.
Well, okay.
But actually,
But accurate.
I think that's the seed of why my dad is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as well as the Country Music Hall of Fame.
Right, and certainly been covered by, as we mentioned, tremendous numbers of rock and roll musicians. So Benji, what was it like what was the experience like working on music with this incredibly rich amount of original source material and compositions? Was it inspiring? Was it
was
challenging?
Stressful and and fulfilling. I mean, I don't know how else to describe that. I mean, I've never been happier or more in my element and more stressed at the same time. And that's it. It was just I had a lot of pressure on me.
Was that Harry pressuring you?
No, not at all. Harry,
I was in too much trouble myself.
yeah, we were both in trouble making
If
this
you knew
movie.
what we had to make this film, it was one of those things where we shot during the day and went out raising money at night to do it because, we won't even go into that story. That'll be part of the book.
No, Harry was one of my biggest fans. He was the one saying, "You need to do this," and I was the one doubting myself. So I can't blame Harry for the stress. And maybe stress I just put on myself.
But I have to tell you that, also out in the audience is Jed's husband, Keith Atkinson, and he helps make all of this possible. And he pretty much runs the Hank Williams estate. And we were giving them some wrong information when we started this film that even the insurance company bought, that the family was behind it, and there were documents and so forth, and those documents weren't for real. And so Benji and I are screening the film in Nashville
at BMI building.
At BMI, trying to make a deal with Universal Records, and Benji's phone rings, and it's
Keith.
And it's Keith who says, "We hear you did a film about Hank Williams." And I think the implication was that we're not very happy about it, and we want to see that film tonight. So we asked the projection if he could stay, and we started screening the film again late that night. And Jet and Keith and other people came, and Benji and I sat in the back of the room praying, and Benji asked what's going to happen. I said, as soon as this is over, they're going to serve court papers on us. and this is going to be tough. And instead, after the movie was over, Jet, you want to take it from here, or I'll just...
Well, my husband and I, they made the movie, and it was, as Harry said, my husband and I were shown the movie, and I'd say it was probably at 95%. They had a couple of weather issues working in the production, but as far as the final product, it was there. And I saw the movie, and my husband saw the movie, and I thought they did a fantastic job, because everything today, from Your Cheating Heart that was in the 60s, to me, this was as close to a Hank Williams movie that I thought that could be portrayed. And I thought that they did it with love, pride, and tenderness. And I was very proud of the product that they did, and I'm very proud to support this movie.
And that's great. Let me just ask you a little bit. So there's a very small scene in the beginning of the movie where Hank Williams stops off and goes to visit the doctor, and that little sequence references your birth, Jet, I believe. And there was an incredible. You were part of an incredibly tangled legacy that he left behind. How did you? And you have an amazing story, but how? And maybe you can just do a little capsule of your story, because it's so. I don't want to do it injustice in any way.
Well, that scene was very near and dear to my heart. But what happened in reality was that my dad went to his lawyers 3 months before I was born. And he had a legal document drawn up, 3 pages, that didn't say anything about but what was going to happen to this baby. And not only did it say, I, Hank Williams, am the father of this baby, I'm going to take this baby. He just didn't count on dying at 29. It is the only notarized document that Hank Williams has ever signed. And in fact, it's used to verify his signature. But he went to his lawyers for his unborn child. He didn't walk away from his responsibility, and he didn't pass it on. He said, this is my baby. I want my baby.
And just to fill in, then you were born 5 days after Hank died?
You have my dad dying on January 1st, okay? Before he left Montgomery, it is true. He had left the money in case my mother, who was pregnant, was living with his mother, and she'd been there since August of '52. And he left the money and says, here's the cab fare. There's letters written saying, I, Hank Williams, the father, will take care of all the hospital bills. And he says, I'm going to leave this because if the baby comes before I can get back, I want to make sure everything's taken care of. He leaves on this faithful trip. They bury him on January the 4th, and I am born before the sun comes up on January the 6th. And the scene that you see toward the end of the movie, they did this without even knowing my thoughts. I've always maintained that my dad's soul left this world and mine was entering. And when I saw that scene at the very end of that movie where that little girl goes to that little window through the ice, and she looks at my dad, and he looks up, and for the first time in the movie, he actually smiles. And they make that eye contact, and then he's gone. My husband looked at me and he goes, oh my God, that was you. And, you know, for me, what happened after he died and I was born, my grandmother, his mother, adopted me. And as I tell people, if I made this story up, it wouldn't be this good. But y'all just got to get the book. We could be here all night talking about me, but what's important is about the last ride. And what I'm so proud about is being included in this, not only being able to contribute, being able to have the opening scene. I had the conversation with my dad that I never met, thanks to technology, to be a part of that, but also too for the directors, the producers, and the screenwriters to actually include part of what really happened during those last 72 hours.
What she's referring to, when the movie began tonight, you heard Hank having a conversation with a young woman who was about to sing. And we put that together from pieces, and he was having that conversation with Jet, his daughter, after 60 years. So.
When you, can you tell a little bit about the background of how the movie actually got made? You alluded to the fact that it wasn't an easy shoot and you were raising money. How did the script, I think Benji, you mentioned that you had brought, or mentioned to me that you had brought the script to Harry. What was that process like?
A friend of mine, Howie Klausner, who lives in Nashville, and he wrote Space Cowboys. He called me up and said, I'm trying to get this movie made. And I was like, yeah, everybody's trying to get a movie made. What is it? And he was like, what's about the last 3 days of Hank Williams' life, which struck me. And you're going to hear, to me, you're going to hear a lot about this. This is not a biopic. So when you hear reviewers or anybody say, this biopic, I didn't want to do a biopic. I didn't want to do the whole typical, poor kid gets, fame, gets into drugs, and rips sinks out of walls and all that stuff. What struck me was it was the last 3 days of his life was always where I knew and I respected Hank Williams, definitely as a writer and definitely as an artist, but it's like what struck me was it was just a little piece of his life. And I said, yeah, send it to me, that'd be great. And when I read the script, it ended up being more about the relationship between the driver and Hank, which I thought was very interesting. It was like, this is a good movie. And I read it and put it on the shelf, and 2 weeks went by and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I called Harry, who is a friend of mine. We were talking about doing some other things together. And I said, Harry, I just got the script and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm going to forward it to you. So I forwarded it to Harry, and then you could take it from here.
Well, and so we decided we were going to do it, thinking we had the blessing of the family, by the way. And so we went out to raise the money, and I'd done another documentary for Fox several years before about President Clinton, and there was a guy over there that was vice president of Fox at the time, and he left Fox and founded his own company, and so he called us and said, I know you're doing this Hank Williams movie, and I want to put up half the budget. And so he gave us a certified check for $1.5 million. And so we get ready and we go shoot, we raise the rest of the money.
You and I raised the other half.
Yeah, right. And we go to Arkansas where we shot the movie. And we get there and it was 5 degrees and snowing. We were on the first day of shooting. And Doug Jackson, the producer of the film, comes walking up beside the camera, and Bitch and I are there, and he says, yeah, guess what? And we say, what? He said, that $1.5 million check, it's counterfeit. So, and I said, you mean we're here, it's the first day of shooting and half our budget just went away? And he said, yep. And so that's how we started that thing, shoot 12-hour days, get dressed, go to dinner parties in Little Rock, try to raise money to complete this film. And so we called Fox and told them, look, we got a problem. A guy, he's left us high and dry, and we need you to help us out a little at least, to temporarily help us out till we get through. And they said, well, who did you this way? And I said, it was a former employee of yours. And I said, they said, well, what was his name? And I told them the guy's name. There was a long silence. And they said, he hit us for millions. And I said, well, I wish somebody had told me. And they said, it's too embarrassing. We didn't want to tell. So you guys cannot go out of this room and tell that, by the way. But
that needs to be a movie. We write the movie about the making of the movie.
Right. And so Fox did come in, and they own the electronic rights. And so that's how we all got together. And then we brought in Seth Willinson, who's somewhere in the audience, who's had major experience in the motion picture distribution, and he's handled the campaign, because we're just breaking it. We're breaking it like they would have in 1952, town by town. Mm-hmm. New York this week, LA next week, Austin the week out, and et cetera. And so it's been interesting. And as far as the music, Michael, I feel like we're cutting you out. It's sort of drifted off toward the movie.
Well, that's
and
okay.
nobody
That's what
knows
it's
more
about,
about the music than you do. And so, anyway, that's...
Well, it's interesting because Harry, you mentioned to me on the phone when we talked earlier that, and I'll ask Michael about this, that when you were growing up, you did not listen to Hank Williams, or I think maybe you said any country music that was not.
No, I didn't even grow up in
your mother didn't
South
think it was
Arkansas.
appropriate. Well, can you talk a little bit, Michael? I was just wondering about country music and its place now in popular culture since then, and also giving us a sense of, we referenced the hillbilly music. I mean, it was fairly ghettoized at that time, or looked down upon, it seems to me.
No, there's a truth to that, but but looking over the charts, and comparing the pop charts, which have been around longer than there was a country music chart, and there was always at some time some of the country artists that would manage to have a little bit of a crossover appeal. I mentioned Eddie Arnold before. He really was somebody who helped. Was the first to help urbanize the music with a different kind of a polished image, and this was at the same time as Hank. But Hank, in his own right, charted 6 pop hits with his original songs, which was quite impressive. I mean, they were all 6 top 40 hits he had. So that goes to show you the strength of his own music, because with the fiddles and the steel, that was not something that would normally cross over into pop. It, of course, became more accepted as what was called the countrypolitan or the Nashville sound started to develop in the late 50s into the 60s with producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley. From time to time, there would be maybe a Hank Williams cover from one of the newer artists, and it was almost, the interesting thing is with the country stars, they their entry into the business, they had to at least do one or two Hank Williams songs, and so that was always a way in. And I think of somebody, for example, like a pop artist like B.J. Thomas, who became popular in the '60s. It was Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, those songs, and Hooked on a Feeling. He had to. One of his early hits was a recording of Hank Williams, "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," and he felt that he would never make it in the business unless he did a Hank Williams song, and that was a big pop hit, and that wasn't a country hit. So there was always, even now, of course, there's a crossover appeal. On and off, it seems to go for a few years, kind of backs off a little bit. Everybody would be familiar with Dolly and Parton, Kenny Rogers in the '70s, '80s having the crossover appeal. Country did have this hillbilly image, but it was polished up through a lot of the smoother sounds in the '50s and '60s. And I would say that, again, the crossover appeal was always there. Hank is important to that, though. I mean, it's his songs that really helped broaden the appeal, as the pop artist recorded his songs earlier on.
And was he moving towards a wider audience, or did the audience come to him? Or was it
I would think the audience came to Hank. It's hard to say what would have really happened if he continued on as the decade progressed in the '50s with the modern technology and the different sounds. But his lyrics are just very universal, and everybody could relate to them. And that's, he's one of the early singer-songwriters when you really think of it. But his songs were not so personal that everybody was able to appreciate his songs. And I think that's what makes it interesting. Some people write today that his songs are so personal, and they may become hits, but it doesn't grab the whole audience. People are not looking to cover this song or to cover that song. It's the Hank's music just has this appeal no matter what your background is, or no matter what part of the country you're from, or the world for that matter.
I remember years ago reading a quote, which may be apocryphal, I don't know, and someone asked Hank Williams what he thought he owed his success to, and he said, apparently he paused and said, "People like to feel sorry for themselves." So, I don't know if that's true or not.
That's pretty good.
I don't know if, are there questions from the audience? And I don't know if there's, yes, I think we have microphones as well.
Was Hank Williams self-taught, or did he go for any kind of musical training?
Totally self-taught. Songwriting and also to guitar playing. He had a mentor called Fred Rose, which was a very successful, that was his publisher. And I think that Fred Rose gave him some guidance, and sometimes people will say, I think really Fred Rose wrote those Hank Williams songs, and I said, I don't think so, because Fred Rose knew what a copyright was, and his name would have been on it, and not Hank Williams.
Especially then. And the interesting thing about Fred Rose, that he was a New Yorker, right? I mean, he wrote a lot of Tin Pan Alley music, too.
Right, and he also wrote Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, Take These Chains, which was one of the last songs my dad recorded.
Right, and I've always, a thought I had, and I stole it from somebody, is that the two closest forms of music, it's somehow appropriate that this movie has its formal premiere Friday night in New York, because the two closest forms of music are Broadway music and country music, because they use elaborate lyrics to tell elaborate stories, and it's always been that way. So there's not that much, there's not as many degrees between Broadway music and country music as there is between either one of those forms and any other form of music.
And musically, my dad's songs also were so appealing because they only had 3 chords. Okay?
Most great songs.
And in the music business, it's called a 1-4-5. And of course, you can take "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" and you can make it, 1 through 100 on the chord progressions. But the point being is that his lyrics were clean, simple. The melodies were on point, and the chord progressions were the 3 chords. And that way, someone that played a guitar or whatever, they could pick up that guitar and they could play a Hank Williams song. And as Michael said, is that when he wrote that lyric, it's like "I'm so lonesome I could cry." There isn't anyone in this world that hasn't been that lonesome. And when you hear that lyric, you think, that guy knows exactly how I feel. And you can take that song and you personalize it. you know, like Hey Good Looking or Your Cheating Heart or whatever. That was the beauty of a Hank Williams song, was he knew exactly how you felt, whether your heart was breaking or you had a smile on your lips.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to know if that guy was ever prosecuted for not for giving you the bad check. And
What Fox asked, I'm not even going to name Fox.
We
What
didn't
they
do
asked
with
me
the
to
FBI.
do was cooperate with the FBI on theirs, and so we spent quite a bit of time talking to the FBI, and justice is slow in America. That's all I can tell you so far.
They were busy
But I'll
with
keep you
mob
posted.
guys and
Right.
and the other part,
racketeers.
the other part of my question is, how much of the story that we saw on the screen was true, namely the driver and getting the Cadillac at the end, and is this all really just fabricated in the last days there?
The driver did not get the Cadillac at the end, but and a lot of the story we had to conjecture that what happened internally. But I think Jet believes we've got reasonably close, and as close as you can on something like this.
Is this based on really a true story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you should say that there was a ride, there was a driver, Charles Carr, who's the driver.
In the beginning,
Yeah.
it says mostly true.
Right.
I think that is
I like
exactly-
that's
I like the disclaimer.
I remember
It says
that.
most of what follows is true, and that's precisely correct, and why we did it.
And is that driver still alive?
Yes, he is.
Oh, really? Wow. Have you had him at a screening or anything? Has he come forward?
It's very long and complicated, but yes, I mean, he's seen the movie and he's fine with it.
Oh, interesting.
Anyone else? Yes. Microphone coming to you.
So, Jed, I play music. I play old-time music, country music, people call it.
God bless you, sir.
People call it bluegrass, but you know the difference. I call it, it's old-time, closer to Irish music. So, I never knew my grandfathers. I knew my father, and I feel for you never having actually met your father. So I'm curious if you had the chance to talk to him. It's a little bit of a personal question, forgive me. But what you would want to ask him. And the other question is, what happened to his instruments, the handwritten songbooks? Do you have any of that? So those are really my questions.
Well, I'll answer the second back end first. Actually, the instruments in the estate, there were only 2 instruments that were listed. It was the D28 Martin that you see in most of the publicity shots, and there was also a 1948 Martin. When I won the court battles, not only was I awarded the copyrights and the publishing, I also inherited my dad's personal belongings. And I ended up with the 1948 Martin, which also happened to be the guitar that was in the movie Your Cheating Heart with George Hamilton. It also happened to be the guitar that Charlie Pride used. He played on his session when he cut Kalijah. And if you look at that hit album, he's holding that guitar. And it also was prominently displayed at the Country Music Hall of Fame for the last 4 years. I also inherited his hats, boots, clothes, BMI awards, and all of which I treasure. If I could have a conversation with my dad, I don't know that I would ask him before I told him that I loved him and that I could not thank him enough for going and signing in the papers. And it's one thing to be the daughter of Hank Williams. It's another thing to have your daddy want you. And as a child that was adopted and put into foster care, the one thing a human wants is to be wanted. And so to grow up in that foster adoption world, you always think, well, something was wrong with me or somebody would have kept me. And then to go back and be able to find your roots and find out that, yes, you were wanted. and that your daddy didn't count on dying at 29. He had everything to live for. When he was in the back seat of that car in this movie, he had the #1 song. He was signed with the Grand Ole Opry. He had his best recording session. He knew his baby was going to be born. He had everything to live for. And so I would tell him, I love you and thank you for loving and wanting me.
This is a question sort of in the back there.
Hi, there's a reference to Tonto. Did the Lone Ranger exist in 1952?
I'm not going to bet that, but there was a reference to Tonto and was asking if the Lone Ranger, in fact, existed in 1952.
Yes, definitely. And by the way, the Pepto-Bismol bottle, that was the correct 1952 bottle. We get a lot of complaints. There's one thing that's technically wrong in the movie that bothers me, and I'll tell you before the end of the night maybe. But we would get calls about the Pepto-Bismol bottle. You know, there's always people ready to pick it apart. No, that's the way the Pepto-Bismol bottle was shaped in 1952. Yeah. And you think people don't recognize him, but you have to remember there were only, that whole route they travel, there were only about 3 television stations on that whole route in 1952. And they, most of them weren't even filming then, so yeah, Hank Williams could walk right in. If you hadn't seen him in concert and you weren't good with recognizing people from pictures, you would never know who he was.
Yeah, it's really...
And he traveled under Luke the Drifter. Luke, that was a real name he traveled under, right?
Well, no, actually, he had another, I think it was Herman's, I can't think of it, but he actually did sign into hotels. He didn't sign Hank Williams. I mean, he actually had another name that he would sign in under.
Any more questions? Up.
Just a comment, a couple of comments. One is that I don't know how much publicity you got, but lucky for me, I was on my way down to New York to see another program in the Upper West Side, and I got my New Yorker just before I left the house, and there was a piece in there about this. But I just want to tell you, I was a teenager in the Hank Williams years, and I lived in Sullivan County, but originally from New York, and we were very New York sophisticates, and that we all went mad for Hank Williams because of WWVA, Wheeling, West Virginia. We'd hear him on the car radio. And then years later, when I came back to New York to live, all these New Yorkers were mad for it. When you reference Hank Williams, everybody knows. I mean, I just thank you so much for this program. It was just a delightful surprise.
Thank you very much.
And oh, by the way, the cars are absolutely on target, all authentic, everyone. I own some of them.
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting is, I don't know, in Sullivan County, but up in that area, I mean, old-timey music, and you're talking about old-timey, so this is such a huge area in upstate New York, not even that far upstate, of old-timey music and a bunch of festivals and jamborees, and it's really interesting. So it's sort of come full circle. You're back where you belong, apparently.
Now in New York too.
Mm-hmm. In New York City, yes, as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and all these other. I'm sorry. Sorry to comment, take away anyone else's time, but the scene is huge here now. I mean, tonight after this, I can go to an old time session, Grizzly Pear on Bleecker Street. Tonight is Jalopy, which is the home of traditional music in Brooklyn. I mean,
well, we hope you'll go tell them to go to the movie Friday night.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that's happening now in sort of Brooklyn, Manhattan. Young people have, taken the music to heart. It's not just North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee. It's expanded now to the north. And in some places in the north, there's more old-time music than there is in certain parts of the South at this point.
When I started out, I had the honor of being, the band was the Drifting Cowboys Band, which consisted of Don Helms and Jerry Rivers. So it was Hank's little girl and a couple of his boys. And I was amazed as we traveled New York, Michigan, that the country music was actually, I thought, stronger in the North than the actual South. And they told, Don and Jerry told me that after World War II, a lot of the Southerners, there wasn't any work for the folks. So they moved north to go to the auto workers and to come to the north because they had the mills and everything. And they brought that music up here, and then through the generations, it really took root. And so that country music was really engrossed into the north. I'd like to say this is that my husband and I have been very fortunate to get a live concert. This is my dad, audio on stage doing a show, and and we're going to release it in September, and he is playing in a place called Niagara Falls, New York.
Yeah, and there's very, very little, I guess I should say, there's very, very little footage of Hank Williams with sound, performing, playing, and I think you probably were doing research, but as far as I know, other than this footage, and I think
Kate
the
Smith,
Kate
which
Smith
was
show,
filmed here. There's 2 Kate Smith shows which were filmed here in New York. He stayed up at the Waldorf. There's also, he did the Perry Como show. The only thing we have, which has not been released, I'm hoping someday someone may find the kinescope or something in their attic. My husband and I actually do have Perry Como wearing a cowboy hat saying, next week my guest will be Mr. Hank Williams. But I'm hoping that, right now with the passage of the generations, leaving this world, a lot of the families are finding treasures, troves, which I call them, and have been kind enough to contact my husband and I because we have, tried to be able to take what we have left to be able to today with today's technology, like the Mother's Best and the Health and Happiness, and be able to work with that and be able to release this and also to preserve them for the generations to come.
And Jack, if you don't mind,
go
I was
ahead,
just going
Michael.
to say that I had the pleasure of interviewing Don Helms not long before he passed.
Shag?
Yeah. And I had asked him if he did come to New York with Hank in those days. And as obviously you mentioned Niagara, but he said they played several spots in western New York State, besides doing the television shows as you were mentioning. So he said, he was up and around here, and a lot of the legends of country from his generation have also, they've enjoyed performing in New York State so much. It's such a great audience and to perform in New York, besides the city, the whole wonderful state we have here. So there really is that passion for the music.
Oh, absolutely. And I also maintain, too, that my dad's just not a country singer or a writer. He is an American folk artist, and his songs today are a part of the American fiber that we've got today, of the life and the love that is so near and dear to all of us.
Yeah, I didn't know if it's intentional. There's a sort of the image of Hank Williams at the end with a piece of paper in his hand reminded me of the stories of Stephen Foster, who also died apparently with a piece of lyric in his hand. I think there's a really strong connection there.
Bob Dylan took those things he was writing on and turned it into an album, right, Jet? Yeah.
Yes, he did, and it was released, I believe, last year. And there's still some more. I call them the shoebox lyrics because they were in shoe boxes. But there's some lyrics that are still there, and I think there's still a treasure trove there to work with. And but I tell you what, only Hank, I think, could have completed the lyrics to make it a hit.
Yes.
One of my all-time favorite songs, and I've lived a lot of years, is I Saw the Light. Does anybody know under what circumstances he wrote I Saw the Light?
Yes, ma'am. He wrote that song when he was 23 years old. A lot of people, there's 2 versions, is that he was coming into Nashville and he saw the WSM light. Well, if he was 23 when he wrote it, he had never been to Nashville. So I kind of debunked that. And the one that I lean with that I think probably is true, that his mother was driving the car, they were coming back, and he saw the lights at Donnelly Airport, which is the Montgomery Airport. And they saw that on, the circular light. And he looked up and he said, I see the light. And from there, that song was written. But it came from the... as I said, if it was written when he was 23, it had to be the Montgomery light and not the Nashville light.
Yes. In the second one.
I'd like to know If and when, I'd like to know, my name is Nick Sharfin, and I'd like to know if and when this is going to be out on DVD.
Well, we're concerned with the theatrical release at the moment, but Harry, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, Fox has decided after seeing the film and thinking, okay, this turned out pretty well, they're holding the DVD, and some of the electronic rights may start earlier than this, but they're holding the DVD till January, which will be the 60th anniversary of Hank's death.
Good idea. And also, I don't see any cameras, but it would be great if you'd include this as an extra thing on the DVD discussing this film, because that's what's great. I'm a big DVD collector, it's obvious. And what makes people buy DVDs, because the sales have gone down quite a bit because through streaming and all that, is things like this, forums, that they include in the package. And I just hope maybe if that's being done, or you should know this, Jet, because you've done it already in that great box set that you put out, is get you people together and discuss the film, how it came about, how you got the people involved. The actors are incredible. The people are selected. And audio commentary as well. And it would make for, hey, look, I might even like to be involved. I worked for Columbia for 21 years. And so I'm promoting a little thing here. I think that's a good idea. Yeah. And believe me, I did a lot of things with them. In fact, I did, starting in 1991, 81 rather, I worked with Columbia till 2002 with the custom market, and I put out all the reissues from that time. All the Monument stuff first came out. I produced all that stuff with Roy Orbison and Chris Christopherson and have you. And I'd love to be involved in this project if it does come out on DVD. So, because I've got quite a background on country music, especially because that's what I was specialized in. And you talked about I Saw the Light. And I believe that was how he got his contract with, publishing contract with Acuff Rose, because Roy recorded that song first, I think even before Hank recorded it, didn't he?
That I don't know about, but I talked to Mr. Mac Wiseman, and he told me the true story was that Molly O'Day heard my dad, and she took 4 of his songs to Fred Rose, and so my dad was actually hired as a writer. Mm-hmm. And they cut these, Molly O'Day cut 4 of his gospel songs. And then she heard my dad sing, and she said to Fred Rose, have you ever heard Hank Williams sing? He said, no. She said, I think you better hear him. But he was bought as a songwriter and not a singer. And, that's another one of those myths and facts.
Well, the thing you mentioned about that is, and I have to inject this, is that it's obvious that Roy Acuff recorded I Saw the Light and had a major size hit on it to begin with. And I would think that when you said before about the influence that Roy had on him, that must have been quite a big deal for him to have Roy Acuff do one of his songs.
Don Helms told me that my dad would stop and go into a place and he'd look at the jukebox, not to see if his cut of his song was on that jukebox, but if somebody else was singing it. And he was more excited and more honored that someone else was singing his song. And he was more a businessman than people gave him credit. He also kept they said he kept a copy of Billboard in his back pocket just to make sure that he was checking where everything was. And, as much as you want to believe he just wrote these songs and, really just did it which he did for the love of it, but he actually had his finger on the pulse. And when all these folks, Joni James and all these people were cutting during his lifetime, that is what really charged him as a writer. I mean, he was proud of what he did, but also, too, he thought that was a much greater honor, is that someone wanted to sing something that he had written.
Well, I was reading that he called Tony Bennett after Tony Bennett sang Cold, Cold Heart. He got him on the phone long distance, and Tony Bennett came on, and your dad said, Tony, why don't you mess up my song? But then he started laughing.
Well, he was real proud that it went to #1 on the pop chart.
Yeah, right.
Tony didn't want to do the song, right?
No, Tony Bennett, what happened was, remember, Fred Rose is from New York. Okay, this is the Mitch Miller show that Tony Bennett's on. Mitch Miller and Fred Rose were friends. So Fred Rose calls Mitch Miller and says, hey, I've got this song. and I'd like for you to listen to it and have someone sing it. Well, Mitch Miller says, I've got just the guy. Well, they give it to Tony Bennett, and, it's like, who is this hillbilly from Tennessee kind of thing, And he wasn't really, he was afraid because a hillbilly wrote it from Tennessee that would, And then Mitch Miller says, you're going to sing the song, Tony. And he sang it, and the rest is history.
It's true. I knew Mitch, by the way. I did a couple interviews with Mitch, and he was in charge. But he was, as I mentioned, some of the other artists. These other artists that initially had success with Hank's songs many of them were under Mitch's leadership. And Mitch had his pulse on what was going on with country music.
Well, as I said, to be a producer, and I think Benji did a fantastic job in the movie. The trick to being a producer is being able to pick a song and pick the right artist and make a marriage between the two, and then you have the hit. Okay, the song is over here, the singer's over there. Sometimes this singer sings that song. It's okay, it's good. Then when you can actually have the ear of Mitch Miller, Owen Bradley, Chet Atkins, that's how come they had hit after hit after hit, not with one artist, but many artists. And Mitch Miller had that ear, and I also think that Benji did a super job in picking the songs, the artists, and also to the placement of the songs that were in The Last Ride.
And also the album that Benji did hit iTunes last night, and we understand it's doing very well.
And by the way, with Mitch, just one more thing. It's interesting because we're talking about him bringing the country songs to the pop artists, but he became so successful at that he wound up bringing Marty Robbins to New York and produced a bunch of Marty's hits like White Sport Coat and Pink Carnation and The Story of My Life, songs like that. So it actually got even more involved, and which, of course, Columbia being such a big record label at the time, yeah.
All right. When you're talking about what we get to glimpse is really Hank Williams as the artist there at the end, but you mentioned, sort of alluded to the fact that he was a businessman. He was terribly ambitious, what I understand, or very ambitious, and also really spent time peddling. I think his radio shows, I can't remember where they were, but he peddled maple syrup and, he
Mother's
was,
Best Flour, Duck Head, Health and Happiness, which was actually an interesting one. That was the Hadacol, and they were very, I don't know if y'all know what Hadacol was. It was a kind of a good feel, a cough syrup or whatever with alcohol in it for those that did not drink.
66%
and
alcohol.
The guy was from Louisiana, and he was actually what they would call a snake oil salesman. But they were very clever when they cut the Health and Happiness. They never mentioned that, so it was able to be syndicated. And so the Health and Happiness was the very first syndicated national radio show that my dad had. And, that also gave him that wider appeal to be able to not be into Nashville or from Alabama, but also to reach New York and to reach California and, and cross this country. And also, too, my dad actually did a USO tour and went to Germany.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A real quick story on that. I was given when they were over in Germany. Of course, then you had East Germany and the communists and all that, and they were close, so they were given a Russian manifest, and I was given my dad's Russian manifest, and y'all excuse my language. But they said when my dad looked at it, he goes, "Well, hell, no wonder they can't win the war. They don't know how to spell." But he didn't realize it was in Russian. He thought that we were trying to do it in English. And that was told to me by Billy Robinson, who played steel guitar for Red Foley, and he was on that tour.
It's only a little. Sorry, I was going to say it's only a little alluded to. But speaking of the war, Hank was. He was born with spina bifida.
Yes, he was. He actually had a back defect, and then of course it was exacerbated by the fact that he was out hunting with Jerry Rivers and tried to jump a creek, and he slipped and fell. Of course, you hear his mother beat him after the firecrackers went off in his pocket, or he ran away and he joined the circus, and the horse bucked him off. But it was a birth defect that became. He also had the back injury, and he had 2 back surgeries.
I'm sorry, Harry.
No, she mentioned Hadacol, and I remember my dad I was a little kid. I was 6 or 7. My dad had a couple of grocery stores, and all the little old ladies would come in and buy alcohol because it was 66% alcohol. And, but it did make them feel better. Oh, yeah. There was no doubt about it.
The happiness part was right.
But the interesting thing is that the guy that put Hadacol together was an escapee and an illegal immigrant from Yugoslavia. And when he got to this country, he renamed himself Tom Parker. Then he renamed himself Colonel Tom Parker. And so he had a Hadacol, and he made millions. And then he pushed Elvis Presley into signing the contract with him. So
there you go.
We've gotten far afield. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
What was the illness that your father died from?
I'm sorry?
She asked what was the actual cause of your father's death? Which is
that remains
been debated.
To be seen.
Yes.
In my opinion as daughter, it is an open investigation.
It was attributed to a heart attack at some points, I think.
Well, as they say, everybody dies of a heart attack.
Right. And another thing, and there were suggestions, which you have really debunked, that there was more, they committed suicide, and there have been a lot of suggestions over the years.
No suicide.
Right.
No. No accident. I hope someday that my husband and I will be able to set the record straight. At this point, I will state publicly, I am not happy with the events, the timeline, or anything that happened on that fateful last ride. There's too many unanswered questions.
I think we have time for one more, if anyone has one. Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to thank Jessica Haight-Monick, and who's been helping us out with not only with the microphone, but putting all this together with the smallest.
And how about a nice
Jessica,
round of applause for our MC?
well,
he did a great job.
Oh, thanks. And Keith, I don't know, we've referenced you a few times, but this is Keith, who is Jet's husband, and as Harry said, the executor or co-executor of
Who, by the way, we couldn't have done this film without.
Yes.
Played a huge part in this.
Right. I want to thank you so much. It's been our pleasure and really our honor to have you here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.